Welcome to the Super Subs with
Andrew.
and Harry, where we talk about anything and everything related to football. This week is actually a special week. We're going to be doing a recap. So this is more about the World Cup, less about the basics of football and about how you learn about the game and how to watch the game. We're going to be doing a preview of what's happened so far and actually what's to come. And the reason that this is a very special episode is we have a first time happening on the Super Subs, a very first time that we've brought a guest on, a special guest named Tim Rollinson, joining us on the Super Subs to talk about his thoughts about the World Cup so far and give our listeners a basic overview of the U.S. men's national team. As all of us, Tim, Andrew, and myself, we're all based in the United States. So before we dive into that, love to ask you, gents, what are you drinking this episode? What quenches your thirst?
I've got a Two Towns cider house right now, so a nice winter classic, a hard cider for the cold California air. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, I got a Fort Point Kolsch style ale. Very crisp, light, refreshing. Yeah, Harry, what do we got over there?
Yeah, so I'm drinking a pale ale from Seven Stills. This is actually a vintage because Seven Stills, the distillery and brewery, actually went out of business due to COVID. Couldn't pick up uh, as much business needed to keep open during the pandemic, and actually recently shut down just a few weeks ago. So this beer, it will never be made again. So I am sipping each sip as if it were my last because will likely be my last. Anyways, let's go on to the intro on Tim and why we brought Tim onto the pod. Really, Tim, I would say his specialty is the U.S. men's national team, and you'll hear Tim go a lot into describing the team, really giving a good overview to you listening to the pod on how you should watch the U.S. men's national team, what you should watch out for, some key players, etc. But Tim, I'll turn it over to you to give an intro on yourself of how you got into football soccer first and foremost, and then how you got into following the U.S. men's national team. And as I know it, you actually not just follow them on TV, but you've seen them in person. You've traveled to watch them as well. So give us and the listeners a brief overview on how you got into the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I actually grew up playing soccer, which I think is a pretty common experience in the United States and around the world. So I was a rec soccer player growing up and always loved that. But I think what really made me fall in love with the game as a fan were the 2006 and the 2010 World Cups. And just seeing, I think, the sport on that global stage, seeing all these countries from different parts of the world come together and play against each other, seeing all the stars, and then obviously seeing the U.S. play, I think was really, really exciting. I remember in particular being in seventh grade, I believe it was, and watching the 2006 World Cup, and just being so excited to see those games and watch that. And it was kind of like the spectacle of the Olympics, but really with the focus on that team sport aspect, which was really cool. I think the Olympics is really about those stars, those individuals. But soccer is such a team sport and a team dynamic, and you can't be good without that. And I think the World Cup has that in its own very, very special way. So that's I think what really got me into it as a fan, and I think what drew me to the U.S. men's national team in particular. Number one, obviously being from the United States, but then I think number two, I just always loved the energy and vibe of the team. They really are underdogs, and in a lot of sports, I don't think the United States is that way. But they're underdogs, and they always had a fighting spirit, kind of a never quit mentality, and I think a lot of the guys that embodied those 2006, 2010 teams. You think about Landon Donovan, Clint Dempsey, Tim Howard. Those guys just, I think, had a real grit about them. Carved their own paths in Europe, and really were I think trailblazers for the game in the United States. And so I think I really just fell in love with that team. And I think there's just so many memories from World Cups seared into my mind. I think in particular the Landon Donovan goal against Algeria in 2010, the Clint Dempsey scoring in the first minute against Ghana in 2014. Tim Howard's performance against Belgium in 2014. I think he maybe has the record for most saves in a World Cup game. So, yeah,
Incredible.
just incredible performances, and I think those just made me a lifelong fan. And it's yeah, I would say my number one sports team is the U.S. men's national team. Yeah.
Amazing. So thank you so much for that intro, Tim. It's evident to us how passionate you are about the U.S. men's national team, and we'll hear more about that a little bit later in the pod. Thank you again for being the first ever guest on the pod. I'm excited to hear your insights and excited to hear you dazzle the listeners with a little bit of your knowledge. Before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit very quickly about what we've seen so far in the World Cup. So I'd love to start off with strongest and weakest team so far from our perspectives. This is not an objective take. This is very subjective based on what we've seen so far, and give a little explanation of why you think this team is the strongest team and you think this team is the weakest team. So Andrew, let's start with you. What teams or nations you think are the strongest so far based on the teams that have played, and why, and which ones or which one is the weakest so far and why?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. I think strongest, I'm going to have to go with the reigning champs, France. They really turned it on today against Australia. A bit of a sucker punch up front with the concession of a quick goal. I believe it was in the 9th minute or so, but they really showed the squad depth. I think Olivier Giroud up top with 2 goals was very impressive. Always finds himself in the right place at the right time. There were a lot of questions going in, and even during the build-up to the first game with the losses of, Karim Benzema, Christopher Nkunku, N'Golo Kante, Pogba. I mean, the list goes on as to whether or not they could actually, put the ball in the back of the net and really produce the same level of quality. But I think they've shown us that they're just as strong, and they are a force to be reckoned with. I think weakest team, I'm going to have to go with the host nation, Qatar. First nation, host nation to ever lose the opening match. They just did not look cohesive. They were, very aggressive, off the ball, a lot of, kind of errant fouls. I just was not very impressed. And, Ecuador actually looked very good. So those are my hot takes. Tim.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I think those are great picks. I'm actually going to copy you on the strongest team. So for me, that has to be France. I think they just, to your point, have so much depth, and I think in particular, watching Kylian Mbappe and the way he kind of pulls the strings for that French team. So in 2018 at the World Cup, it was kind of his coming out party. He was a young player who really showed the world how high level he was, and I think a lot of us may not watch him on a week to week basis. He plays in the French league, which isn't as easily available in the United States, but you can see just how much he's grown as a player over the last 4 years. I think he's always been an elite counterattack player, but I think on top of that, he's just so creative in possession. So quick with his decision making, and just such a difference maker for that French team. And then there's just tons of talent around him in every single position. So I just think they have to be one of the favorites moving forward, especially after today's performance. And then I think the weakest team for me is going to be Iran. I think they are a very experienced team. I think they're the oldest team at the World Cup. But I just thought they looked totally out of sync in the game against England. And I think with a team like that that's so experienced, you would expect them to have some cohesion and be a united front, and maybe give a team like England some fits. But they just couldn't string passes together. Really looked discouraged after the first couple of quick goals. So I think that was a team that looked weaker than expected from my perspective. Harry, who do you got?
Yeah, so for strongest team, I'm going to go England. And the sole reason being, I'm just going to go pure goals. They put 6 past Iran. I think they were the only team that on paper, they're incredibly strong coming into the World Cup based on just squad depth. And then when they stepped out on the pitch, they delivered in terms of strength, based on number of goals, just their attacking force and linking up play. Um, Harry Kane, who plays in the Premier League, who is England's star striker. He's not just a person that puts goals in the net, but he can link up play. He can play behind. He can actually track back, and defend. He does a little bit of pressing, but he's really, really known for being just that flexible, all around striker for England that actually adds that bit of dynamism to the team itself and actually makes the team function that much better, almost similar to a center midfielder or a number 10 in the role that he plays sometime in their attacking plays when they go forward with the ball. So I'm very impressed with England. I know there's definitely going to be some nations that impress all three of us as we go further into the group stage. So far, I think England have made the best showing. I would say the weakest team, in my opinion, was Qatar, based on just the World Cup being in their country. A lot of fans rally around the host nation and their own nation when they're going to watch a game. And the fact that a lot of Qatari fans left the stadium around halftime just shows how discouraged they were at the showing against Ecuador. Granted, Ecuador came out really well in the first half. And the second half, I would say both teams were finding gaps to just go in and try to get that goal. It was 0-0 in the second half, but 2-0 in the first half to Ecuador. And you could see how disjointed they were. And I think Andrew put it well. Just the players were being aggressive and they were going in, and there was no real cohesion within the team. So I'm going to have to put Qatar as my weakest team so far. Let's get into the most entertaining game, though. So aside from the strongest team and the weakest team that we think from our perspective so far, what game gave you the most joy to watch? What was really entertaining, fun to watch? You'd watch it again, just even if it wasn't a live game so far in the group stages. And then what game are you both looking forward to the most and why? Andrew, let's start with you again.
Yeah, I mean, just pure bias. I'm going to have to go with the U.S. men's game against Wales yesterday. I think there was a lot of questions going in regarding the experience of the team, experience of our coach, Greg Berhalter, whether or not we could, really put a cohesive unit against, what is maybe not a world powerhouse, but still, a strong team with a lot of European-based players. I thought we had a lot of great possession, a lot of great opportunities for a good portion of the game. Unfortunately, with the equalizer by Gareth Bale, due to the penalty conceded by Walker Zimmerman, I think that we lost a lot of steam in the back half. It was a shame to end the game as a tie. I think there are still some questions that remain unanswered, but I think we did show a lot of good talent, a lot of good strength, especially in the midfield. We can talk about that later. Outside of that game, I thought, Senegal, Netherlands was really interesting. I think you have that, the reigning AFCON champions versus a traditional powerhouse. Very impressive end of the game with a couple quick goals from Cody Gakpo and I believe Janssen at the very end. As far as games I'm looking forward to, it's got to be US versus England on Black Friday. Cannot wait. It's going to be so exciting. I think that it should be a good game. I'm cautiously optimistic. I know that obviously England has a lot of squad depth, a lot of very talented players, a lot of cohesion, but I think that if we can be up for it, I think it'll be a good match. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to copy you again. So I think my most exciting match so far was also the U.S. Wales, and I think being a huge U.S. men's national team fan, it's been 8 years in the making since their last World Cup game. They missed out on the World Cup in 2018. So just seeing them back out there, every single player on the squad, with the exception of DeAndre Yedlin, who came in at the end as a sub, this is their first World Cup. So seeing these young players make their World Cup debut was really, really exciting. I think they came out to play, looked really strong for the first 35 minutes, I'd say. Got the first goal, which was really great on a beautiful attacking sequence with Christian Pulisic and Timothy Weah. So I think just having that World Cup moment was super, super exciting. besides that, I think the big upset that came in very, very late night last night on our side of the world, Saudi Arabia beating Argentina, who's one of the favorites in the tournament. I think that's super exciting. I think that's what the World Cup's all about, is seeing these different countries come together and compete. So it was cool to see that happen. And then the game that I'm most excited for also has to be U.S. England. I think that there's obviously a history there with the countries. These teams also faced off at the World Cup in 2010 and drew 1-1. And I just think it's going to be a really, really exciting matchup. I think England is obviously the more established of the two teams, but I think the U.S. has enough good players to give them a really good match. So really just can't wait for that. Harry, what about you?
Yeah, entertaining game so far. I would have to say the France-Australia game today, and more so because everyone expects France to come out and dominate games. They are the reigning World Cup champions of 2018 in Russia, and just their talent pool is also insane. A lot of players injured though, so Pogba, Conte, and Karim Benzema, who is the Ballon d'Or winner. For those just tuning in and getting familiar with the sport of football or soccer, winning a Ballon d'Or is the equivalent of just the best player for a certain calendar year overall in world soccer. So whether you play in Europe, whether you play in South America, Central America, all around the world, Asia, you can be nominated by your different nations. So journalists from different nations nominate you and put your name in the pool and vote for you. And a lot of these players perform at the highest level in Europe or whatever nation they play for. And Karim Benzema is a striker for France that was supposed to play at this World Cup, but unfortunately got injured during training right before the game against Australia. But nevertheless, everyone expected them to come out really hot and dominate Australia. Australia is not ranked too highly, but Australia actually got the first goal. And for the first 10, 20, 30 minutes, it looked like it could be a huge upset. But once you see France go through the gears, from first to second to third to fourth, Kylian Mbappe, I think, Andrew, you might have mentioned him a little bit earlier on the pod, but he's just someone that once he gets going, he can cut through a defense like a hot knife through butter and just get a pass, a shot away. And he's just so dynamic. And the whole team, I think, has enough talent to make it really far through the World Cup. So I really like seeing the ups and downs and the highs and lows of both teams in a match like that. And I think we're going to get a lot of matches like that where a lot of the powerhouses may need a little bit of time to actually get wound up and to get going during the game. And I'd say the game I'm looking forward to the most, we're to go 3 for 3, all U.S. fans, and we're looking forward to the U.S. match against England. And I think personally it's a great matchup because England on paper have just the better team talent-wise. A lot of them play at the highest level. A lot of them are paid the big bucks, obviously, so they have to perform week in, week out for their clubs in whatever nation they're a part of. But this England squad, as England fans love to say it, it's coming home. And US fans love to always, in the sport of soccer, as Tim actually alluded to, we are the underdogs. For a lot of other sports, we love to dominate, but in soccer, we're getting to that point, and we're getting to the point where we have the talent pool building up, and Tim's going to talk a little bit about that. But I think it's going to be a great matchup to actually see how the US and England play. And if the US, and for our fans out there, when you tie or when you draw a game in the World Cup, it still counts for points for both nations. So getting even a draw or a tie against England as the US would be actually, I would say personally, a pretty good result. I would say that that's a result we'd take any day. If we get a win, that's absolutely fantastic. And if we lose, well, I hope we win or draw. Let's just say that. But let's go into the U.S. men's national team. I think that's a perfect transition, Tim. You are our in-house expert. I think we're obviously going to have you on for future episodes to talk about the U.S. men's national team if you're willing. But for our listeners that are just getting into football or soccer and watching the World Cup for either the first time or maybe the second or third time, and maybe they are from the US but haven't gone into the US men's national team for a variety of reasons, whether it's talent, whether it's unfamiliarity with some of the players' names. They're not in the biggest leagues and you don't see them day in, day out making headlines, having hundreds of millions of Instagram followers, if that means anything. I'd love to hear just an overview of the players, the team, what you think about their talent so far, and how you think they'll fare in the World Cup.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's super fun to talk about this. But yeah, I think if you look at just soccer in general in the U.S., I think it's always been really popular as a youth sport. But I think where the U.S. has really struggled in comparison to some of the world powers, if you look at the South American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and then some of the European countries, you think of England, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, is kind of forming that talent, spotting that talent, and then moving that talent to the highest level and really developing it. And so I think in the U.S., if you look at kind of how it's been traditionally, up until I would say the MLS debuted in the mid '90s, the U.S. team was made up of amateurs. So this was college players. This was players playing indoor soccer. There were a couple guys who made the journey over to Europe to play in those leagues, but there was no professional outdoor domestic league for players to get better at and play full time. I think that really changed after the 1994 World Cup when the MLS debuted, and players could do that as a full time job, and those top players would go to college, get drafted into the MLS, and then if they were cream of the crop, they could make that move to Europe and play in those leagues over there. I think what we're seeing with the most recent development in U.S. soccer is the introduction of MLS teams having academies. So that's something that European teams have is as kids play, when they're growing up, they'll have competitive teams that are actually linked to the professional teams. And then those professional teams can develop those players as teenagers and then move them into eventually their first team, so they can become professionals. And so there's no equivalent of college soccer in Europe or in at least as a track to become a professional. So this track is becoming a lot more popular in the U.S. where players will actually become professionals and not go to college. And so they'll be 16, 17 years old, sign pro contracts and start playing in Major League Soccer. And I think that's really improved the talent of the U.S. men's national team. If you look at players like Tyler Adams or Weston McKennie, these guys played in academies growing up, really became top level players who had the experience playing against professionals at 16, 17 years old. And then by the time they were 18, 19, they were signing contracts with European teams and showing that they brought value. So Weston McKennie, on his 18th birthday, he was playing for Schalke in the Bundesliga. The next season, they were the second best team in the league, and he's playing in the Champions League. All right, Tyler Adams, same kind of deal, playing for New York Red Bulls, gets signed to Red Bull Leipzig in Germany, and is playing in the Champions League before he's 20 years old. So there's just a really exciting young crop, and I think it's just the start of what's coming through. If you look at the team right now, I think their strength is their energy, their pace, that they believe that they can do it because they are playing at that high level. Christian Pulisic's a Champions League winner. He scored in the Champions League semifinal. He almost had a goal in the final. So I mean, he's played on the biggest stages there are. And so I think these guys are going in with no fear. I think the biggest challenge for this team is experience. So if you look at the key players, a lot of them aren't week in, week out starters. They're just, I would say, if you wanted to look at an equivalent in American sports, it would be like a rookie or a second year player who's kind of developing into that superstar, but isn't quite there yet, isn't relied on to carry a team. And I think for the most part, the U.S. players aren't quite there. And so I think that's where it's going to be a bit challenging to have these players play the full 90 at the international level and really make an impact. Now, if we look at the game yesterday against Wales, I thought they came out really strong, showed that they were ready to play, and put together some really nice combinations. I think if you look at that first half, I think every U.S. fan probably came out of that feeling pretty confident and pretty happy about the performance they put in. And I think it tailed off in the second half, and I think again that probably shows some of that inexperience playing against top level talent, playing 90 minutes, and so yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be a U.S. fan. Number one, just because I think the team now is super fun, super likable guys, all different backgrounds. I think they're a diverse group of guys, both when you look at where they come from in terms of different states and some of them different countries with U.S. heritage, allowing them to play for the U.S. national team, but then also racial backgrounds, I think economic backgrounds. I think it's really cool. A lot of them came from military families, so it's just a really likable, exciting young group of guys, and I think this is a great showcase for them. So I think they still have a great chance to get out of their group and make some noise in this tournament. I think, like you said, Harry, I think getting a result against England is going to be really, really crucial. But even if they lose that game, they can still get through on a win from Iran if some other things break right for them. So yeah, I think prospects are looking bright. Hoping they can make a little run here, but either way, I think there's a lot to look forward to for soccer or football fans in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said also, Tim. Some people actually pursue U.S. nationality or citizenship because they want to be part of the U.S. squad. And I think Carter Vickers is one of those players, right? I think father is American. His mother is British or from the UK, and he was born in the UK as well. So when I was watching interviews of him, I was like, wow, this is not an American accent. But there's quite a few players like that, right? Anthony Robinson, a few other players that play for the US. And for our listeners, a lot of players at this World Cup may not even be born in the country that they're actually representing, but they have heritage either through a relative. It's either usually through their immediate parent or maybe grandparent, even sometimes to actually be considered for this country. One example is Matty Cash. He plays for Poland, but I don't think he speaks maybe more than a few phrases of Polish. I've seen some of his interviews. So it's very interesting to see. I think, Tim, you brought it up the best, that diversity of the U.S. squad. A lot of other teams, they're either of one color or not too much of a different mix of people. But on the U.S. squad, you see so many people from so many different places. Represents the country as well as it should. So I think a few questions for you before we have closing thoughts, Tim. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think you gave a great example of where U.S. soccer is today and where it's going. The squad is exciting. We're starting to pursue the model of European academies, sending young talents off to Europe instead of going to college. Tell me your thoughts. How do we get to the next level of U.S. soccer? So we're here right now. We've climbed a lot from the 1990s, from hosting the World Cup, from, like you said, going from amateur soccer football players to pro college, MLS, and really growing our leagues. How do we get to that next step to really start to get even closer to European talent, to the infrastructure, whether it's talent, whether it's things that we need to change as a country or anything like that? What are your thoughts on getting just soccer as a whole in the U.S. to the next level?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think there's probably a lot of different pieces to that. But I think the most crucial part to it is raising the level of the domestic league, and then investing in young talent. So if you look at countries like Argentina, like Brazil, most of their top players are playing in Europe, but people are still crazy about their domestic leagues, and their domestic leagues are pretty much where every young player begins. So I think giving those young players an opportunity at a professional level is super crucial. And usually on World Cup international rosters, those teams will still have the top players from their domestic leagues. So I think it's really, really important that the MLS continues to raise that level, and I think it's going in that direction. And I think a key piece to that is becoming a development league, not only for folks from the U.S. but from uh, Latin America, I think Central America, the Caribbean, and then South America. So for players from Ecuador, Paraguay, even Brazil and Argentina, giving them that opportunity to make a good wage in the U.S., have that good infrastructure, and then give them that hope that they can get sold to Europe. I think a great example of that in the English Premier League right now, somebody who's really tearing it up is Miguel Almiron. So he was actually from Paraguay, bought and played in Atlanta for a couple years, was absolutely incredible in the MLS, and then got bought by Newcastle. So I think that's an example of a player that shows that. I think another one that's more of a homegrown talent is Alphonso Davies, the Bayern Munich star. He's from Canada, grew up there, and came through the Vancouver Whitecaps Academy, and then went to Bayern Munich. A lot of people thought he would be a project, but pretty much made an immediate impact. So yeah, I think that's a huge piece. And then I think that the second piece is those clubs, the MLS clubs, investing in youth players and giving them playing time. So I think the two examples of clubs that have done a really good job and where it's paid off is the Philadelphia Union, and then FC Dallas. So Philadelphia Union, if you look at Brendan Aronson, Mark McKenzie, Brendan Aronson's brother actually just got bought by Frankfurt the other day, and so Paxton, exactly. So Philly has kind of created that pipeline, and they're being paid well for it, right? They're getting millions of dollars in transfer fees that they can then reinvest in their academy, and continue to do well in the domestic league. And then FC Dallas is where so many top players have come through. So Weston McKennie, Chris Richards, Brian Reynolds, Ricardo Pepi, these are all guys who are now playing in Europe who came through the FC Dallas Academy. So I think the teams continuing to invest in that is going to be really, really key. And I think those those case studies, I think will kind of create a great example that more teams will start to emulate, and we'll see that pipeline just grow and grow. And the hope is that this generation of young talent isn't a golden generation, isn't a one-time thing, but is actually like a trend that continues on, right? Like with a team like Brazil, people would almost never say it's a golden generation, because every generation in Brazil is a golden generation, right? Like they always have talent coming through the pipeline, whether it's Ronaldinho, or Neymar now. It's like just constantly they have these superstars coming through. So I think that would be the goal, is that it's not one Pulisic, it's not one Tyler Adams, it's just a whole string of those players who are kind of making it in the US, and then going to Europe to take that next step.
Yeah. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you for the next question, and then maybe we'll have time for one last question before we close it out. So, Andrew, take it away.
Yeah, would love to hear just a quick bit. What are your thoughts on our U.S. men's national team coach, Greg Berhalter? He's come under a little bit of heat after the Wales tie. Do you think he's the right man for the job? Too inexperienced? Does he need more time? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I wouldn't say that I feel super strongly in any certain direction on this. I would say he's a manager where I think he has really, really defined strengths, and then some weaknesses that are pretty easy to spot as well. So on the strength side of things, I think what I like about him is that he's very encouraging. He creates a really good environment for the players, and they seem to really, really love being a part of the international setup, which I think is super, super crucial, right? Because these guys are on their basically taking time off from their job that's paying them to go represent their country. And if that's a chore, that's gonna show up in their play. But I think all the U.S. players, if you look, they love going to camp. They love seeing their friends. They're coming from the same generation, and I think he's really created a really, really good core in that way. And I think done a really good job of getting a few key dual nationals is what they call those folks that could represent multiple different countries, getting some of those players to come to the US. I think at the end of the day, the players that he's picked to be his kind of core are the right players. So if you look at the starting lineup against Wales yesterday, I think it's pretty spot on in terms of the best players that have showed up for the US in the past and have the top talent. I think where I think his weaknesses are is a couple things. Number one, his in-game adjustments I think can be super tough. So the Wales game is an example. At halftime, they brought on a striker named Kiefer Moore, and they really switched up the way that they played. The U.S. didn't make any adjustments at halftime, or even if it wasn't at halftime, after they saw that Wales was changing the way that they were playing, they were being much more direct, playing it to Kiefer Moore, who was 6'5", playing it to his head and letting him win those aerial duels. I think that's when, as a coach, you need to look at that, assess, and say, okay, how are we going to then change our tactics to then match that? Because we're seeing that switch things up. So I think his substitutions yesterday fell flat for sure.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one case, but I think that's happened in other cases as well. But for the most part, I think international soccer or international football is a tough game, and I think you look at any country, there's usually criticism of the national team manager just because they don't have that many chances. So I would say I'm relatively neutral, but I would love to see him be a little quicker with his subs. I think in the game against Wales, a lot of the players were super tired, and it showed in the play in the second half. And then number two, I think being a little bit more tactically flexible and/or responsive, I think would be what I'd say, and give the team a chance to win, even when maybe the game script flips a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
I love that. Tim, last question for you before we close it out. So we're talking about young talent, and you outlined that as one of the key pieces of U.S. soccer to really get us to the next level. And we have a lot of that coming nowadays, skipping college, going off to Europe, developing in academies. Over the years, we had young talents here and there in the U.S. historically. I think Freddie Adu being one of the most notable names, and I see a big smile on your face, Tim. What's the difference nowadays? We have talent that have played in U.S. soccer when they were 15 or 16. Maybe not as many nowadays, but we had some here and there. But what's the difference today that makes it a lot more noticeable for U.S. men's national players to be in Europe and to actually get those chances to play for Champions League, Europa League teams, or to be in the top leagues in Europe? What happened from when Freddie Adu was playing to now when we have a huge expansion of players all over the world?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I mean, I think really with any youth like international youth contingent, right? Like if you take a look at, like, let's just say the 15-year-olds in any given country, there's going to be those top talents that are already identified at that age. But what you'll see is that oftentimes those folks don't work out. Like those particular players, when they get to the professional level, a lot of them can't crack it. And the difference is, you're playing against people your age until you get to the professional level, and then you're playing against people who have been paid to do this for a decade or more, right? Like that is a big shift from, playing youth soccer to playing professional soccer. And I think the biggest thing is just having numbers and having the amount of players to actually have one or two or three or four that hit and become those world-class players. So when we had Freddie Adu, who was, I would say, one of the top youth talents, not just from the U.S. but globally at the time, I think when he was 13, 14, 15 years old. That's one guy, and so it's just basically riding on his shoulders, and I think that's a lot of pressure on one person. Um, there's a kid now, and his older brother I think is in kind of the U20 setup, so in the 20-year-old age range for the US, but he's I think 13, 14, 15 years old, and he's already being scouted by Real Madrid, Barcelona, all these top teams, and they're saying like, okay, this kid could be like a world class player one day. He's playing like way above his age level, but you'll never hear about him in the U.S. media, and that's because there's Christian Pulisic, Gio Reyna. There's players that are already playing at those top clubs, so it's not a headline, right? Like it's not as exciting to have a kid getting scouted by Real Madrid when you have Serginho Dest playing at Barcelona. So I think there's a couple things that have just kind of shifted, taking the pressure off those individuals, and then shifting it I think more towards the whole contingent. And I think that's a really, really good sea change, and hopefully we start to see that develop.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for your thoughts. I think all our listeners can echo Andrew and I when we say that you've been a beacon of light and knowledge on the podcast itself. I'd love to get into closing thoughts. So let's start with you, Tim. What if you could describe to our listeners in the rest of the group stage, the round of 16, semis, quarters, and finals, what should they look out for? What are things that they should watch out for the rest of the World Cup? There's not that much. I think there's only about a month left of World Cup play. So what are some key tips that you would give our listeners to look out for the rest of the World Cup?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say one thing that I would recommend for anybody is in this group stage, something we haven't got to see yet is Brazil play. And I think that is just a team that is really, really unique. Number one, they just have so much talent, and they're just such a soccer crazed nation. And I think traditionally they've always brought one of the most talented teams to the World Cup, and I think this year is no different. So I think that's a really exciting thing to watch, and see if that talent can live up to that and bring a good performance. The other thing that I would say is I think take this opportunity to get to know players from different parts of the world and appreciate how cool it is that soccer extends to every corner of the globe. I think one thing that I love is seeing players who come from countries that aren't just those traditional European powerhouses. One that's coming to mind immediately is Son Heung-min. I might have butchered that, but he's a forward from Korea, and he plays in the English Premier League. But he's just a top level talent. One was the top scorer in the English Premier League last year. And South Korea, even though they did make the semis of the World Cup in 2002, they're not a traditional soccer power, and so having a talent like that I think is really, really cool. So just getting to know some of the stars and top players from around the world, and not just those big names that you see more regularly, I think is a cool part of the World Cup.
Yeah. Andrew, let's turn over to you. What are some closing thoughts you have for our listeners, and what would you give them in terms of tips or thoughts in watching the rest of the World Cup?
Definitely. Yeah. I think first and foremost, I think just try to enjoy it. I think, this happens only once every 4 years. It's super exciting. It's not like an individual sport like the Olympics. There's, an entire team that you're rallying behind. So whether you're a new fan or a seasoned fan, I think try to get out, watch as many games as you can. Friday, day after Thanksgiving for us here in the U.S., it's going to be really exciting to watch the England match, 11 a.m. here on the West Coast. So should be a decent time for most fans. Second, I think it's great to watch underdog teams. I think that there are a lot of dark horses, a lot of underdog teams here in the World Cup. I don't think many people expected Croatia in the last World Cup to go as far as they did. There's been a lot of talk about Denmark, other such countries. So keep an eye out for the countries that seem to be punching above their weight. So yeah, keep an eye out. Harry, what do you think?
Yeah, so I want to echo a lot of your thoughts, Andrew. So for listeners out there, every country that makes it to the World Cup, we talked about in our last episode the way that you actually qualify for the World Cup, or our last two episodes. And it's not an easy path. I mean, qualification starts 3 years before a World Cup begins, and you play in each region that you're part of. And to actually get to the World Cup, you still have to be a fairly strong country in the region that you're part of in terms of FIFA. Obviously, the host country gets pretty much an auto in because they're hosting the World Cup. So Qatar this year has qualified automatically for the World Cup, while the other 31 countries are there because they've earned the right to play at the World Cup. So all the countries are good in terms of talent. So a great example of that is today's early morning game against between Saudi Arabia and Argentina. No one, if you asked 100 people, 99 out of 100, or maybe 99.9, if you can get 0.9 of a person to say it, will say that Argentina would have won the game, or at least drawn the game. No one would have predicted a Saudi Arabian win 2-1 against Argentina. So I think you have to look at every game as a chance to, I think Andrew said it well, every 4 years it happens. It's not just rooting for your country, but every game is entertainment at its finest. You can get an upset at any moment. You can see a crazy score line. 6-2, I would say, is a pretty fantastic score line in terms of England versus Iran. Or you could see a 0-0, 1-1, a really grinding draw against two teams that are really battling it out for points. So if I had a tip for listeners, it would be to pay attention to as many matches as you can. Obviously, if you're working, it's understandable. But if you can get to matches, watch them, enjoy them, and root for teams that you support, root for teams that you don't support, but you like as well. So there's a lot of matches yet to be played and a lot of matches to enjoy. So I think that's it for closing thoughts. Once again, a big thank you to Tim. For those of you that are listening this far, this is actually our second attempt at this podcast. The first one, we had a few technical issues. Thank you, Tim, for being an amazing sport, for being on the Super Subs and being our first ever guest. That was today's episode of the Super Subs with
Andrew
and Harry. Tune in next time for the basic rules and regulations of football, where we talk about the basics of what you should know as a newer fan of football. So if you're a new fan or getting into the sport because of the World Cup, or if you want a refresher of what the rules are, what's a yellow card, what's a red card, what are offsides? It's something that's unknown, and a lot of people don't understand how to explain or even how to look out for in a football or soccer match. So Andrew and I will describe a few of the top rules and regulations and most basic rules that you should watch out for. But other than that, subbing out for now. Catch you on the pod next time.